How the most infamous serial killers were caught. The date is April 16th, 1975. You are Sergeant Bob Hayward, a Utah Highway Patrol officer doing his nightly patrol. You're driving up and down suburban roads thinking about this crazy shark movie that just came out called Jaws, when all of a sudden you notice something peculiar. You see a tan 1968 Volkswagen Beetle parked outside of a house at 3 a.m. Reasonably, this looks suspicious to you, so you take a closer look. However, as you approach the vehicle, they speed off. You pursue this vehicle, and fortunately, you're able to pull it over. This person was obviously up to no good, and you don't know what you're walking up to. You exit your cruiser and walk towards the vehicle with your gun drawn. Deep down, you're terrified, and you just hope that the other person is more terrified than you are. You command the driver to get out of the Beetle, and they comply. They apologize and say that they were just up late watching a movie in the drive-in theater. However, the movie the suspect claimed they had seen at the drive-in wasn't playing at the drive-in, and you knew that, which made you suspicious enough to check their vehicle. A decision that likely has a significant impact on the course of history. During the search of your vehicle, you find a lot of things, and it seems that they only get more and more grim. You find gloves, pantyhose, ripped sheets, rope, a flashlight, a ski mask, an ice pick, trash bags, and handcuffs. Things that normal people don't keep in their vehicle. Although possessing these items and keeping them in your car is suspicious, it's not a crime. However, fortunately, you were able to still bring this suspect in for evading an officer. You collect information about your suspect and you realize that his name is Ted Bundy, a name that you will soon never forget. Ted wasn't in jail long as he was freed on bond, but your findings in his vehicle were enough to get you talking, specifically to your fellow officers. You speak to detectives at your station about this encounter, and they too find the description of this Volkswagen Beetle and the name Bundy oddly familiar. It's at this point when the detectives in Utah contact investigators in Washington, where they learn that this weird Bundy guy was on their very short list of murder suspects in a series of murders. Coincidentally, however, the murders that took place in Washington stopped as soon as Bundy left and relocated from Washington to Utah. And coincidentally as well, disappearances then started to begin in Utah. If alarm bells weren't already ringing, they were now off the chain. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming it's no spoiler that Ted Bundy is one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. His unbelievably depraved actions are the reason we still talk about him to this day, as a cautionary tale. Let me quickly summarize his methods. Ted Bundy was a wolf in sheep's clothing, always hidden in plain sight. Although he was an active serial killer, he was working within the justice system and was even present on his own crime scenes. Not only that, but he had an unassuming character. He was considered handsome, looked and acted normal, and was considered charming by some. And he more so fit the description of a model citizen than a serial killer, which is one of the biggest reasons why he was able to go on for so long without being caught. It's actually quite upsetting to know how many pretty obvious clues were ignored by the police simply because they just didn't assume Ted was the type of guy to do that, which is obviously why you should never judge a book by its cover. Ted Bundy was a very methodical killer, with a system that he had down to a science. Ted preyed on primarily young white women. He would typically lurk around colleges and universities where he could easily find his next victim. But he usually wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was directly in your face and would approach women, typically in an arm sling or crutches to appear helpless and to gain sympathy points from the woman, and he would ask random women if they would be able to help him either put books in his car or something along those lines. Basically any lie to get the women to believe that they're helping a helpless, kind gentleman do something in or around his car. And if these kind women did make it to his vehicle, chances were it was basically done for them. At this point, Ted would bludgeon these women, typically to the point of unconsciousness or even death, and then do a multitude of things, typically engaging in on top of mutilating the body in ways that I can't even begin to explain, such as cutting off the victim's head and keeping it as a trophy and taking pictures with his victims as a sort of twisted, happy memory. And then once he felt he was done, he would dump the body somewhere, typically in multiple pieces. But even then, in some instances, he wasn't done, as there is cases where he would go back to visit these bodies he had dumped multiple times. Ted Bundy was extremely twisted, but fortunately, this video is focused on justice. And in this case, justice was served, albeit much later than it should have been. The string of murders committed by Ted Bundy had been going on for years at this point. But on November 8th, 1974, 1 year before his run-in with the police at the beginning of this segment, Bundy kidnapped a woman that would soon become his downfall. He picked up this 18-year-old woman from the Fashion Place Mall outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. And of course, he had devious intentions. But unlike many before her, she was able to escape, saving her life. Over 1 year later, on October 2nd in 1975, only 2 months after the run-in with the police, this same woman picked Bundy out of a lineup in the police station, confirming that this man was the man who kidnapped her 1 year prior. And this one positive ID in this one police lineup was able to bring this entire thing to justice. As 1 year later, on March 1st, 1976, Bundy was found guilty for kidnapping and sentenced up to 15 years. Obviously, Bundy did much worse than kidnapping, but this was a start. And for him, he saw this as the beginning of the end. But if you think this is the conclusion of how Ted Bundy got caught, you're definitely mistaken, because this is only the first of many times this man was caught. In 1977, another year later, Bundy was extradited to Colorado for the murder of one of his victims, which was progress in terms of justice. But during this time, he escaped from a second-story window when he was left alone for only a few moments. He spent 6 days living in the wild outside of the prison in Aspen and was then found and taken back into custody. However, only a few months later, he escaped from his jail cell in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And things took a dark turn once again. Bundy wasn't living in the woods for 6 days. He was on the run for months, and during this time, he would attack 5 people and kill 3 of them. And by people, I mean young, innocent women. On February 15th, 1978, another officer spotted a stolen vehicle around 1:30 a.m. in Pensacola, Florida, and decided to pursue this vehicle. Once again, Bundy was taken into custody, and this officer didn't even know the level of monster that he had in the back of his cruiser. When Bundy was brought to the police station, he refused to say his name for over 2 days. A detective was able to get him to confess that his name was Theodore Chapman Bundy, but for some reason the detective didn't connect the dots and realized that this was Ted Bundy, the serial killer that was currently on the loose. Fortunately, this mistake wasn't extremely consequential, as they did shortly after connect the dots. And on July 24th, 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted on 2 counts of murder. Although while he was in custody, he admitted to over 30 murders, and there is suspected to be even more, although those are not confirmed. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed at Florida State Prison at the age of 42. So now, if somebody asks you, how did Ted Bundy get caught? Not only do you know the answer, but now you know to ask, well, which time? The time he was first brought into custody for acting suspicious, the time that he ran away from the courthouse and was in the trees for 6 days and then was caught and brought back, the time that he broke out of prison with a hacksaw and was on another killing rampage for 2 months before being brought back. There's a few times he was caught, but in all seriousness, my description of this case only scratches the surface, and even the process of how he was caught and his court chronicles, where he not only represented himself but also proposed to his girlfriend at the time in court. There's a lot of lore to this story, and if you want to learn more about it, I actually have a video that goes specifically in depth on these serial killers, which I'll put at the end of the video. Bundy was executed via the electric chair with crowds watching as he perished, and his final words were a message of love for his family and friends, if he even had any left. The year is 1978. You're a police officer in Ohio. It's Friday night and you just started your shift. Due to a new safe driving initiative, you're tasked with field sobriety tests. And so far, your night is uneventful. A car drives up to your cruiser and stops. You look inside the vehicle and it's a young man. An awkward looking one at that. He and the car both seem normal, but you get an odd vibe. You ask him if he'd been drinking and awkwardly, he says no. He doesn't seem drunk, just strange. And to alleviate your discomfort, you let him go. Little did you know, the person that you just spoke with wasn't any ordinary teenager. You just stopped one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. Not only that, he had the body of his first victim in the car with him. You had just let go Jeffrey Dahmer. If this police officer had potentially acted more so on his strange feeling and looked around more, potentially one of the most infamous and disgusting serial killers would have been caught a lot sooner. But unfortunately, this early encounter was uneventful and marked the beginning of his disgusting killing spree. Jeffrey Dahmer, similar to Ted Bundy, was a rather unassuming serial killer who was social, active in the community, likable, and for those reasons, able to operate almost directly under the nose of the police for way longer than he ever should have been able to. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't a particularly brilliant serial killer who crossed all of his T's and dotted all of his I's. If you're familiar with how he committed his murders and what he did after the fact, there was a lot of opportunities for evidence to be found and dots to be connected, and unfortunately, the police took way too long to connect those dots. Jeffrey Dahmer's father was an analytical chemist, which may seem unassuming but led to a morbid curiosity that ended up consuming Jeffrey Dahmer's life. Jeffrey's father taught him how to preserve animal bones with bleach, and they would even look around their property together to find dead animals to dissect and preserve and bleach the skin and connective tissue of these dead animals. Jeffrey's father thought he was sharing insight into his career with potentially interesting information, but to Jeffrey, this information was highly interesting, and unfortunately, it was taken in a completely wrong direction, which we'll get into. On top of this weird dissection and scientific process, if you want to call it that, Jeff showed signs of trauma in his younger years, specifically torture butchering animals and being rather quiet and reserved. His father even admitted that there were signs that he didn't notice at the time, which is questionable. After graduating high school, Dahmer attended a party, something he did relatively often as he tried his best to be social and was at this point already experiencing a rather nasty alcohol addiction. On the way home after this party, Jeffrey picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, another 18-year-old man. They both went back to Dahmer's place to hang out and drink, and while Stephen didn't have any sort of romantic intentions, Jeffrey did. And when Jeffrey got the clue that things likely weren't going to happen, he took matters into his own hands in the worst way possible. Dahmer grabbed a dumbbell and hit this man over the head, knocking him unconscious. He then strangled the man and then assaulted his body for his own personal satisfaction. And then at that point, used what he had been practicing on animals on a person for the first time. And unfortunately, this was not the only time either. After mutilating and dismembering the body, Dahmer packed it into his car where he was driving to dispose of it. And it was on this drive where Dahmer met the police officer. If only this police officer chose to do a search, we would be living in a much different timeline. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And although Dahmer was caught, he was not caught then. And after this instance, he was able to kill and hurt many more people. At the age of 19, Dahmer got involved in the military, where he was suspected to have done unsavory things with soldiers and was kicked out at the age of 22. After this, he began his hand in the professional world, where he was unsuccessful in holding a steady job due to his alcohol abuse. He started exposing himself to women and children at playgrounds, where he was caught and charged for indecent exposure, although this will be one of his most tame convictions we touch on in this entire video. Dahmer's sadistic urges were beginning to take a hold of him, and he was back on the hunt, looking for control. It was around this time in his early 20s where Dahmer began frequenting bathhouses and gay bars, where he would meet men, hang out, and then take control, to put it in his words. Dahmer was most commonly drinking these men that he was meeting under the table, and due to his high alcohol tolerance, the people that he was with were unable to keep up and likely would pass out before Jeffrey was even feeling a buzz. In these instances, Jeffrey would take advantage of these people, but even with how manipulative and horrible this is still only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Jeffrey Dahmer. He wasn't really convicted for any of these unwanted touchings, but he did get a 1-year probationary sentence for indecent exposure once again. In 1987, Dahmer knew that indecent exposure and drugging and assaulting men just wasn't enough, and he felt that he needed to get back to his old ways. Dahmer said that this second murder in the beginning of this next chapter of serial killings was actually an accident. He said he just woke up in a hotel with a dead person beside him. And even if that was true, any normal person would at that point call the police. But of course, that's not what Jeff did. Dahmer stuffed this person into a suitcase and took him out of the hotel. He took this body back to his grandmother's house, where he dismembered it, assaulted the body, and cut this person's head off and boiled it to keep the skull for his own personal use, to say the least. This trend would continue drugging, assaulting, and killing men over the next years. I know I've already gotten into detail, but there is so many disgusting and gruesome details associated with exactly what Jeffrey Dahmer would do to his victims, and there is a ton of videos about that. So let's focus in on the point of this video. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. But how exactly did he get caught? Well, as he continued his spree, he got less and less cautious and more hasty, as he simply cared less and less and was too caught up in his own fantasies, it seemed. On July 22nd, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer lured a man named Tracy Edwards into his apartment, offering to pay him $100 for nude photographs. When they got to the apartment, that's when things started to go wrong. Dahmer attempted to handcuff this man and threatened him with a knife, and Edward smartly played along, trying to keep Dahmer calm and unassuming of him trying to escape. After spending 5 hours together, Tracy was able to punch Dahmer in the face and flee, getting out of the apartment and onto the street, where he flagged down 2 police officers. At this point, Tracy was barely clothed and still had a handcuff on his wrist. The police followed Tracy back to Dahmer's apartment, where Dahmer admitted to putting handcuffs on this man, but doing nothing wrong. However, the police weren't satisfied with that answer and searched the apartment, which is when one of the officers discovered Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies. And after seeing this evidence, the police handcuffed Dahmer after a bit of a power struggle. A search that took place later on uncovered a collection of human remains and other vile things that I won't even get into. Dahmer confessed to all of the murders and waived his right to a lawyer during his interrogations. And over a 2-week span, detectives were able to get Dahmer to admit to his crimes and detail them specifically. And in detail, he outlined 17 murders of men and boys between 1978 and 1991. The following year, on January 13th, 1992, Dahmer pled guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. Dahmer wasn't sentenced to death in the court system, but he was by another inmate. And during his time serving 15 consecutive life sentences, He was beaten to death with a blunt object by another inmate. Some people thought this was a poetic ending to his reign of terrors, while others didn't think that this was quite justice. No matter how you feel about this situation, the Jeffrey Dahmer story is extremely upsetting and honestly disgusting, and if you haven't seen it yet, there's an entire Netflix documentary about it. But to answer your question, how was Jeffrey Dahmer caught? One of his victims was finally able to escape and expose his human deli to the police and eventually the world. I do want to say that because I do post weekly, I'm not able to make extremely long videos. I try my best though, and I think on average 15 to 30 minutes isn't bad. But with that being said, unfortunately, there is a lot of serial killers that have existed, and fortunately, there are a lot who have also been caught. Ideally, there wouldn't be any serial killers to catch, but that's a different story. I say this because if you guys enjoyed this topic and this video, I would love to make another one, potentially a part 2, and maybe even make a series out of it. So before we get into our last killer, if you guys enjoy learning about these serial killers and how they eventually got caught, let me know in the comments below or give this video a like. If I see enough comments, then I will definitely make a part 2. Now, let's start the story. You're a young man in the Chicago area, and you're looking for a job. You just graduated high school and you don't want to go to college, you want to get into the trades. It's a growing opportunity that doesn't require an education, and that interests you. Your uncle's friend is a local business owner and politician, and he says that this man could help get you a job. He introduces you to this man and you guys set plans to discuss a potential employment opportunity. This man invites you over to dinner, which you're rather comfortable with because you've seen this man before and you've even been to a few of his events. He's been known to have block parties and he even likes to dress up at times as a clown, of all things. During your time with this man, you guys discussed employment opportunities, pay, expectations, previous experience, and all of the regular things you may expect you would discuss during a job interview. The interview comes to a close and you feel optimistic, hoping that you're gonna get a job soon and potentially start a lifelong career, when the man you've been sitting across the table with asks you if you want to see a cool trick. You don't want to be rude, so you go with it, and he invites you into his basement. In the basement, he shows you handcuffs, and you're interested and kind of confused. Where did you get these? Are these real? How do they work? He doesn't really explain, but he says, put them on, I'm gonna show you something. So once again, almost hesitantly, you go with it. You allow him to handcuff you, and then he shows you that he has the keys, but not in a reassuring way, almost in a taunting sort of way. At this point, the vibe shifts immediately, and the professional man that you were just talking to upstairs is now a creepy and demented seeming individual who, at the drop of a hat, switched. The man who you thought would become your boss is now picking up a hammer, and he is now becoming the last thing you would ever see. That man was John Wayne Gacy. We're really 3 for 3 in this video because John Wayne Gacy, like Jeffrey Dahmer and like Ted Bundy, was a very unassuming person who also committed most of his crimes in the 70s, which is an interesting overlap as well. I wonder if there was something in the water, but who knows? John Wayne Gacy lived in the northern suburbs of Chicago and owned a successful construction company and was a seemingly loyal father and husband to his second wife and 2 stepdaughters. He even attended church and was active in the Polish community. Gacy was also involved in the Democratic Party and through that had some interesting connections. Connections that I'm assuming now wish they had nothing to do with Gacy. Gacy was known, like I mentioned in the story, for throwing block parties, inviting the police, neighbors, and anybody in the community who wanted to celebrate, enjoy food, and even see a clown perform some tricks. That clown being Pogo the Clown, which was Gacy's alter ego. But even in this condition, in the northern suburbs of Chicago, living a seemingly nice life, before anything was ever found out, before he was ever caught for his 32 murders, he already had a dark and shadowy past. Gacy was previously arrested for assaulting 2 young men in Iowa. And if that's not crazy enough, this was also the exact same time when his first wife was giving birth to his child. Literally insane. For these crimes in Iowa, Gacy was caught and served time in prison. He was sentenced to 10 years but only got 18 months and was released on parole. So technically that was the first time Gacy was caught, but that's not the only time he was caught, so let's keep going. It was after this release from prison when Gacy divorced his first wife and moved to Chicago, where now we're up to speed. From the outside, it seemed that Gacy was living a great and rather successful life, but that couldn't be further from the truth. His marriage was falling apart after telling his wife that he was bisexual and wanting to get men involved in their relations, and their divorce left Gacy a lot of free time to indulge in his fantasies. On December 7th, 1976, A young man named Robert, who was working at a pharmacy, stayed after work to talk to a man who said that he could have a construction job available for him. Sound familiar? Gacy offered to pay him double what he was making. An interesting proposal to anybody. This young pharmacist obviously was never seen again. And worst of all, while Robert was meeting with Gacy, his mom was outside waiting for him to finish work and to drive him home, as she was his ride and she was gonna take him home so they could spend time together, as it was his mom's birthday. Once again, horrible timing. Fortunately, in this situation, the police weren't completely oblivious. And almost immediately after this case was brought to the police were already suspecting something was up with Gacy, specifically because they knew about his past, and one of the detectives on this case even called Gacy directly. Although, to be fair, one of Gacy's own employees went missing, and when people begged the police to investigate Gacy then, which was only a year prior, those requests were ignored. If you really want to be mad, in 1977, a young man went to the police station and reported that Gacy had kidnapped him and threatened him with a gun. And when questioned, Gacy admitted to the entire situation, but said that it was consensual and that this man was lying. And the police sided with Gacy in this situation, and he was let off. I know, crazy. I didn't mean for this video to be a compilation of horrible police work, but that's definitely becoming a common theme. Back to the Rob situation. After the investigation continued, the police were able to get a search warrant for Gacy after he was late for the interview that they requested of him. Gacy reluctantly gave his keys to the police, and he was held at the station while they searched his home. The police found a receipt for a roll of film that Rob had owned, proving that Rob had been in Gacy's house. And they also found a ring that another lost boy was missing. Although they weren't able to charge him with anything with these facts, they were able to put him under surveillance, but they did have to let him go at this point in time. Strangely, while under surveillance, Gacy invited the two police officers watching him into his house and offered them coffee. These officers noticed a horrible smell inside the house, a smell that a police officer would definitely recognize. The smell of death. But still, this wasn't the end quite yet. Days later, while still obviously under surveillance, Gacy was caught selling weed to a gas station employee, where he was arrested and once again interrogated, where detectives had more ammo to interrogate him with, and they threatened to literally rip up his floorboards if he did not tell the truth, which they obviously meant hypothetically, but physically they did end up doing that and finding exactly what they were looking for. While in jail, he did admit to killing one person, but claimed it was only self-defense. Gacy led police to the place in his basement where he hid one body, and upon further investigation, the police found a trapdoor where they found at least 3 other bodies. When this information was shared with Gacy, and Gacy knew the jig was up, he went on a multi-hour-long rant, speaking in the third person like a lunatic, admitting to everything, and claimed that he had killed at least 32 young men and boys, and that 27 of them were buried on his property. In April of 1979, a grand jury indicted Gacy on a total of 33 murders, which at that point in history was the largest number of murders associated with one person. While in custody, Gacy admitted to more and more gruesome details about his murders, and the police were able to validate all of these stories by finding evidence within his home. On February 6, 1980, Gacy pled not guilty to all of the charges, and his lawyers tried to pull a insanity card, but that didn't work. Gacy was of course found guilty and sentenced to death. After 15 years on death row, Gacy was killed by lethal injection on May 10th, 1994. But there you have it. 3 of the most infamous serial killers and how they got caught. The similarities between these people are rather glaring, and I think it's important to note that when we talk about such depraved individuals, that these are real people that hurt real people, that have real families, and there are real victims in this situation. If you guys feel like you've gotten your true crime fix, then allow me to recommend the video I made that's a bit different. It's shorter and it's one complete story. And it's a video about what it would be like to be a medieval plague doctor, and it's something I put a lot of work into. Check it out. It's on screen now. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. And as always, trust me, bro.